about Cuba and Venezuela. We need to talk about this, and we need to keep it on the radar fucking endlessly. There is this lack of action right now. There's plenty of denouncement. There's no action. The domestic resistance is zero. 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 None in the USA. Think about the ridiculousness of the 5 months that we've passed so far this year. The president of Venezuela was kidnapped, taken to New York, put into a dungeon there. There was like a week of minor protests organized by like the PSL and a couple of other groups. And then everyone just started going back to normal. The mayor of New York is a DSA member. His city is being used by the US federal government to put foreign heads of state in a dungeon. And he is not doing anything about it. He's not saying anything about it. What the hell? Like, we can talk all we want about Delcy Rodriguez being turned by the US government, blah, blah, blah. Fundamentally, they probably told her, do whatever you want or we kill you. Fundamentally, and she's like, okay, well, I don't want to die. So, well, ultimately, she probably is a traitor. She probably is. Ultimately, she's between a rock and a hard place with no good option, and I think many of us could not say that we would not cave in the same situation. There were US military exercises in Caracas this past week. American planes doing fucking military exercises in the capital of a country that until 5 months ago was one of the bastions of resisting American imperialism in Latin America. Doing fucking military exercises this past week. There were US military exercises in Caracas this past week. American planes doing fucking military exercises in the capital of a country that until 5 months ago was one of the bastions of resisting American imperialism in Latin America. Is this certainly the fault of traitors in the Venezuelan government? Sure, but ultimately, when they have no allies, when there's no domestic pressure to make this sort of thing impossible in the USA, what can they do? What can they fucking do? And if they were able to do that to Venezuela, to Maduro, by the way, like, Maduro is way, way, way more important of a figurehead than anyone in Cuba right now. There is no one individual in Cuba who is anywhere near as like ingrained as this figure of the important political leader that Maduro was. In Cuba, you have a very decentralized power structure where anyone could be the president and they'd all be the same. In Venezuela, it wasn't like that at all. So you would think the reaction to it would be extremely, like, powerful. You know, the leader has been kidnapped. This emblematic leader of a country that is a victim of American imperialism has been kidnapped to New York City. Us anti-imperialists in the USA, we can rally around this. This is a new paradigm for us. You know, the leader has been kidnapped. This emblematic leader of a country that is a victim of American imperialism has been kidnapped to New York City. Us anti-imperialists in the USA, we can rally around this. This is a new paradigm for us. We can fight this and we can also then extend that to fighting other things. But it was like, we're going to protest for a week and then it's just going to drop off the radar. And we don't even know when his next hearing is. When is it? I don't know. No one's talking about it. We talk about it, but we don't do. Maybe social media has made us morons. I don't know. Social media makes us feel like we do something, so we don't have to get up and do it anymore. And then Cuba, they want to do the same shit to Cuba somehow. We saw it with the indictment against Raul Castro. They definitely want to do something to Cuba. Now, Cuba's a different beast to Venezuela. Cuba's military is much better funded, much better trained, has very experienced officers, and the chain of command is like they fought wars in Africa. It's a totally different to Venezuela. Now, Cuba's a different beast to Venezuela. Cuba's military is much better funded, much better trained, has very experienced officers, and the chain of command is like they fought wars in Africa. It's much better funded to Cuba. Now, Cuba's a different beast to Venezuela. Cuba's military is much better funded, much better trained, has very experienced officers, and the chain of command is like they fought wars in Africa. It's a totally different to Venezuela. It would not be as easy for them in Cuba without a massive betrayal. But at the same time, like the ones who have the most power to really do something about this aren't the Cuban military. It's the Americans at home who have the power to make this so inconvenient for them that they don't even think about doing it. But the resistance is none. The resistance isn't there. This was like a potential. I don't know why I'm saying this, because Gaza was before this and it didn't really result in that much. But this was another potential Vietnam War moment after Gaza, right? A potential for like a massive movement against imperialism. And it was a fart. It was a little fart. Not even like two farts in succession. Just a tiny little peep, like nothing. Against imperialism. And it was a fart. It was a little fart. Not even like two farts in succession. Just a tiny little peep, like nothing. And they're just going to try to do something to Cuba. It might not go as well as they hoped it would, but they're just going to try to do something to Cuba. It's really fucking obvious that they want to do something in Cuba. It's just not clear what. And it's scarcely talked about. The mayor of the city where Maduro is prisoner has not even said anything, let alone done anything. They've been bombing random fishermen in the Caribbean for more than a year at this point. It's just something has fundamentally changed that has made the US even worse in terms of the resistance to imperialism. It is so much worse. There's certain things that you can point to that are correlated with it, like the integration of racial minorities into the broader system. They've been given a lot more to lose than they had 40, 50 years ago. Social media, phones, the internet, the spread of technology, all this sort of thing has surely played a part in it. But I still think there can and should be more. Like, look at Bolivia. In Bolivia, a lot more to lose than they had 40, 50 years ago. Social media, phones, the internet, the spread of technology, all this sort of thing has surely played a part in it. But I still think there can and should be more. Like, look at Bolivia. In Bolivia, people have been bombing random fishermen in the Caribbean for more than a year at this point. It's just something has fundamentally changed that has made the US even worse in terms of the resistance to imperialism. It is so much worse. There's certain things that you can point to that are correlated with it, like the integration of racial minorities into the broader system. They've been given a lot more to lose than they had 40, 50 years ago. Social media, phones, the internet, the spread of technology, all this sort of thing has surely played a part in it. But I still think there can and should be more. Like, look at Bolivia. In Bolivia, people have phone. In Bolivia, people have social media. In Bolivia, people have internet. In Bolivia, people have Marvel. They have Marvel movie. They have Taylor Swift. But they fight. Americans can do it too. I just wish they did it for people in other countries. They don't even do it for themselves. I know what I'm talking about.
It's time to talk about what's happening in Bolivia. Look at the images. The tension is not easing. Protests continue to fill the streets. In the last few hours, Bolivian President Rodrigo...
Bolivians are fighting. And the thing is, the situation in Bolivia isn't even that bad, and they're already out in the fucking street. Like, I do think, yeah, this is like the last gasp of the dying American empire that Trump is helping to accelerate. You know, long live the butcher Trump, who works in spite of himself to create the conditions of the fall of the American empire. That's what I always say. However, in the interim, we can mitigate how many people the empire is going to take down with it through action. Where is the action? This shit needs to be way more on the agenda. I would say it needs to be a priority right now for the US left. You know, get out on the street, cause problems for them, make them think twice. Make them think that if they do something to Cuba, something bad will happen. Make them think that if they do something to Cuba, you know, something even bigger than what you're showing them you're willing to do will happen. Make them think twice. You have the power. You have the ability. You have the mayor of New York City, where fucking Maduro is prisoner. Cuba and Venezuela have to be on top of the agenda right now. And they aren't. We're just forgetting about them. And it's crazy, man. It's fucking crazy.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and in it we're going to read a piece titled On Why I'm Leaving the Party, written in 2024 by Khadija, a former member of the CPUSA in New York. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So if you've been following this channel for some time, you know that we have been trying to facilitate discussion about what's going on with the CPUSA. The Communist Party of the United States was founded about a century ago, at a time following the Russian Revolution and the founding of the Third Communist International, when communist parties were being founded in many countries, oftentimes as splits off of the existing Socialist Party. The Communist International, or Comintern itself, having been founded to replace the old, fallen, and discredited opportunist Second Socialist International, which became discredited under the leadership of people like Karl Kautsky, who opportunistically called the Third Communist on with the CPUSA. The Communist Party of the United States was founded about a century ago, at a time following the Russian Revolution and the founding of the Third Communist International, when communist parties were being founded in many countries, oftentimes as splits off of the existing Socialist Party. The Communist International, or Comintern itself, having been founded to replace the old, fallen, and discredited opportunist Second Socialist International, which became discredited
この世を渡り歩くにはより多くの身分を持った方が便利なの。君にもいくつか作ってあげようか。悪くない芽が出たわ。今日も引き続きサボりましょう。調子が良くなってから仕事を一気に終わらせるわよ。 情報提供者から知らせがあったわ。うん。どうやらまた新たな変数が現れたようね。この世を渡り歩くにはより多くの身分を持った方が便利なの。君にも
Under the leadership of people when communist parties about what's going on with the CPUSA. The Communist Party of the United States was founded about a century ago, at a time following the Russian Revolution and the founding of the Third Communist International, when communist parties were being founded in many countries, oftentimes as splits off of the existing Socialist Party. The Communist International, or Comintern itself, having been founded to replace the old, fallen, and discredited opportunist Second Socialist International, which became discredited under the leadership of people like Karl Kautsky, who opportunistically sold out the working class of Europe for World War I. Unfortunately, the successes of the CPUSA were fairly short-lived. By the 1940s, under the leadership of General Secretary Earl Browder, the party fell into horrific revisionism.
ほらほら、いやそれよ、ほらほら。それよ、いやそれよ。
気をつけて。チレ。
掃除対象。
腐食死にせ。
せ。はあ。
一緒に遊ぼうよ。
カズン。チレ。
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。
走るより。カズン。
足元に気をつけて。
気をつけて。
腐食死にせ。
風だ。一緒に遊ぼうよ。
千人のご高齢だ。
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。
物語は始まったばかりだよ。
任せて。
ここだよ。
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。走るより飛ぶ方が。
塵となってください。
足元に気をつけて。気をつけて。八方の風。風だ。
真意を知りたくば受けている。記録し見定めよ。
海に沈め。やっ
これを月に捧
採血の時。
平穏ちょい。僕を称えよ。歌え。僕の名のもと足の下のマスを上げてあげる。
全ては摂理と星から生まれる。
世界を熱狂の渦に。
限界に
冷
沈め。
凍の時間よ。最高の一品よ。新月が来る。
神の炎。
食前に甘いものを。
巡れ。
採血
これを
の
月を捧げ、目の下も満足させてあげる。世界の熱狂の渦に。ほれや冷凍の時間。三月よ。
記録し見定めよ。
星が光り輝くがいい。
採血
ランのように
の
羽ばたく。今宵月を
今のは悪くなかった。
記録し見定めよ。
変わる。
星から生まれる。
さあ月よ輝けね。
自由になれ。
少女の神。却下す。この天下で裁く。止める勇気はあるか。
周りを見張っててくれ。じゃあな。
太陽の炎。ここより炎。決して消えない。 万物には終わりがある。時間も例外ではない。アビスは世界の影だ。消えることはなく、そこにあり続ける。
絶縁障壁展開全滅モード。終わりね。撤収よっと
足元が救われません。
どの目が出るかし
ほら、夜ですね。
輝くがいい。
星々静かに眠る。急がなくてもいいのよ。
アドリブを聞かせましょう。ファンのように
夜です。
羽ばたけ。終わりね。
撤収
痛がっちゃいない。
限界に沈む。
目を閉してお静かに。
いい度胸ね。
夜です。
かかれ。あら、どの目が出るかしら。
よっ
もいいのよ。痛がっちゃいない。真実はまるで星々を静かに
目の下の
叫びよ。終わりね。撤収。捕まえた。真実はまるで影よっ。丸裸にしてやる。
食前
私は帰ってきた。
巡れやっ
いやおらおらいやそりゃおらおら
慣れない土地では地元のガイドは破った方がいいぞ。
執務室でペットを飼おうかと考えたことがあったが、日差しすら届かない場所で暮らすなんて犬や猫がかわいそうすぎると思ってやめたんだ。
慣れない土地では地元のガイドは破った方がいいぞ。
俺の背中にメルジー
ここだよ。
任せて。物語は始まったばかりだ。燃えろ。
せい
全力攻撃。
一緒に遊ぼうよ。今に見ておれ。お前にやろう。
危ない。物語は始まったばっ。はあ。みんなは俺が
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。足元に気をつけて。乱暴だな。はっふう。おっ。イランパチューキ、わしにて。
全力攻撃。物語は始まったばかりだよ。
一緒に遊ぼうよ。風だ。はっふったここだよ。おったはっ真理は
物語は始まったばかりだよ。気をみんながそばにいてくれるわ。
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。足元に気をつけた。はあ一緒に遊ぼうよ。
運命の変わり目。任せて。
イランパチューキ、
みんなは俺が守れ。もう
風だ。はっはあ
あまり遠くに行くなよ。
イカズチのごとく。カウント。
この天下で裁く。アクセル全開。
動くな。投稿し。
周りを見張っててくれ。自由になれ。
もっと早く、もっと強く。合図を待つ。
聞け。太陽の炎を。止める勇気はあるか。
最後の警告だ。
じゃあな。さあみんなに挨拶だ。
イカズチのごとく。聞け。よく見とけ。
石煙に葬られよ。アクセル全開。
武器を捨てろ。法の裁き。
行け。もう自由だ。自由にな。
呼吸を整えよう。
聞け。太陽の炎を。
真意を知りたくば受けてみる。記録し
防衛モード。
見定めよ。採決の時。
移して絶縁障壁。世界の熱狂の渦に。
記録し見定めよ。全ては摂理と星から生まれる。
おい、さよなら。カジャーン歌え。僕の流れて今宵月を掃除対象ロックオン塵となってください。あよっ
我が恥を。
おい行こう。はい僕をたたえよ。光り輝くがいい。移して三月よ輝け。
試練終わりだ。
じゃあな。
カウント。
石煙に葬られよ。
これは
さあみんなに挨拶だ。自由になる。
雷のごとく合図を待つ。
この天下で裁く。死ね死ね。止める勇気はあるか。投降しろ。武器を捨てろ。
じゃあな、周りを見張ってて。
もっと早くもっと強く動く。
石煙に葬られよ。アクセル全開。死ね。
あまり遠くに行くなよ。さあみんな。
雷のごとく。
腐食新鮮
足元に気を今に見ておれ。よっと真理は
くらえみんながそばにいる気をつけて
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。ほったたふったほ
物語は始まったばかりだよみんなは俺が
お前にやろう。ここだよ。はっ風だ。ふっはっ足元に気をつけて。はあ一緒に
腐食新鮮危ないみんながそばにいてくれれば
真理は逃げようなんて思わないでよね。はっほっふったたはっはっ足元に気を。
物語は始まったばかりだよまだみんなは俺が守れ
お前にやろう。風だ。ふうたはあふったはっほ
運命の変わり目みんながそばに
わしに手を出すつもりか。逃げようなんて思わないでよね。ほっ足元に気をつけて。
運命の変わり目全力攻撃
真理は動くな。
じゃあな
呼吸を整えよう。カウント。
この天下で裁く加速するぞ
最後すぐ。これはきつい。
あまり遠くに行くなよ周りを見ろ
もっと早くもっと強く。よく見とけ。動け。
聞け太陽の本能を止める勇気はあるアクセル全開
投降しろ。
行けもう自由だ自由に
雷のごとく。
この天下で裁く加速するぞ
この裁きを受けてこい。武器を捨てろ。
じゃあな
もっと早くもっと強く。け動け。
石煙に葬られよ
投降しろ。最後の警告だ。武器を捨てろ。さ
周りを見張っててくれ
武器を捨てろ。
アクセル全あまり遠くに行くなよ
呼吸を整えよう。引け引け。合図を待つ。
この天下で裁く加速するぞ行けもう自由だじゃあな
よく見とけ。動け。
石煙に葬 挨拶だ。
もっと早く。
太陽の本能を加速するぞ。
最後の警告。
行け、もう自由だ。じゃあな。
呼吸を整えよう。動け。
この天下で裁く。
武器を捨てろ。
周りを見張っててくれ。
雷のごとくカウント。
石煙に葬られよ。
動くな。
行け、もう自由だ。自由。
動け。
太陽の本能を。
真意を知りたくば受けてみ
絶対に障壁。
見定めよ。記録し見定めよ。
掃除対象。
すべて
世界の
は
熱狂の渦にを広める。移して防衛モード起動。交渉は終わりです。新月
神の炎
来る。光り輝くがいい。
差し貫け。
じゃじゃーん。世界の熱狂の渦に。今宵月を捧げ満ちて絶縁障壁。行こうか。
記録し見定めよ。
三月よ輝け戻れて防衛モ
すべて
ード
は摂理と
殲滅
星から
モード。
生まれる。
今宵月を捧げ掃除対象。
真意を知りたくば受けてみ記録し見定めよ。 記録し見定めよ。すべては摂理と星から生まれる。
満ちて三月よ輝け掃除対象行こ
我が勝ち。
うはい光り輝くがいい真実が来る絶縁衝撃天体交渉は終わるはっおいおさあ
排除せねば。
遠くを映して
記録し見定めよ。
掃除対象
記録し見定めよ。
お披露目だ流れて三月よ輝け
摂理と星から
防衛モード
生まれる。
起動塵となってください行こう遠くを満ちて今宵月を刺さ掃除対象やばヒルチャールのお兄さんが病気になったヒル
真意を知りたくば受けてみる。記録し見定めよ。
行こう
記録し見定めよ。
僕の生も映して三月よ輝け
すべては摂理と星から生まれる。
流れて今宵月を刺す掃除対象ロックオン全滅モード光り輝くがいい行こう
採血の
ガジャーン真実が来る防衛モードよっ
記録し見定めよ。
はいいってらっしゃい世界を熱狂の渦に三月よ輝け満ちて掃除対象ロックオン
記録し見定めよう。全ては摂理と星から生まれる。
僕の生元にフォークを移して通い月絶縁障壁よっ
知ればが終わりだ。
今に見ておれ。
気をつけて。はっさ物語は始まったばっ
ここだよ。わしに手を出すつもり。イランバシュ
みんなは俺が
うんたはあ風だ。足元に気をつけて。はっここだよ。真理は循環する。
運命の変わり目。みんながそばに
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。足元に気をつけて。はあ暖房だ。ここだよ。
物語は始まったばかりだよ。
お前にやろう。
くらえ全力攻撃。
風だ。ふうはあはあ
腐食神聖任せて。
今に見ておれ。
みんながそばに
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。足元に気をつけて。
運命の変わり目。任せて燃えろ。みんなは俺が。
真理は風だ。
物語は始まったばかりだよ。気を
つもりか。
物語は始まった。
足元に気をつけて。
あちゃー、後悔してもおっと、イランパシューキ。
全力攻撃だ。
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。
物語は始まった。
ここだよ。
気をつけて。みんながそばにいてくれるわ。
お前にやろう。
風だ足元に気をつけて。
物語は始まったばかりだよ。みんなは俺が守れ。
イランパシューキ。
ここだよ。逃げようなんて思わないでよね。
腐食新生。気をつけて。全力攻撃だ。もう
今に見ておれ。お前にやろう。
一緒に遊ぼうよ。風だ。足元に気をつけて。
腐食新生。気をつけて。みんながそばにいて。
わしに手を出すつもりか。真理は。
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。ここだよ。
腐食新生。危ない。みんなは俺が守れ。
イラン。
任せて。物語は始まった。
今に見ておれ。
足元に気を。一緒に遊ぼうよ。
後悔しても遅いぞ。よっ、
くらえ。全力攻撃。
お前にやろう。
物語は始まったばかりだよ。
足元に気をつけて。風だ。一緒に遊ぼうよ。ここだよ。
気をつけて。運命の変わり目。みんなは俺が
イランパシューキ。
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。足元に気をつけて。ここだよ。
任せて。運命の変わり目。みんながそばにいてくれるわ。
真理は。
風だ。一緒に遊ぼうよ。
任せて。運命の変わり目。みんなは俺が守れ。
今に見ておれ。
逃げようなんて思わないでよね。
腐食新生。任せて。全力攻撃。
イランパシューキ。
風だ。ここだよ。乱暴だな。
basically not even social democracy, or in other words, reformism rather than revolution, when communist parties were being founded in many countries, oftentimes as splits off of the existing Socialist Party, the Communist International, or Comintern itself, having been founded to replace the old, fallen, and discredited opportunist Second Socialist Party, the Communist International, or Comintern itself, having been founded to replace the old, fallen, and discredited opportunist Second Socialist International, which became discredited under the leadership off of the existing Socialist Party, the Communist International, or Comintern itself, having been founded to replace the old, fallen, and discredited opportunist Second Socialist International, which became discredited under the leadership of people like Karl Kautsky, who opportunistically sold out the working class of Europe for World War I. Unfortunately, the successes of the CPUSA were fairly short-lived. By the 1940s, under the leadership of General Secretary Earl Browder, the party fell into horrific revisionism. Basically not even social democracy, or in other words, reformism rather than revolution, but just kind of straight up liberalism. In other words, not even really seen as a under the leadership of General Secretary Earl Browder, the party fell into horrific revisionism. Basically not even social democracy, or in other words, reformism rather than revolution, but just kind of straight up liberalism. In other words, not even really seeing socialism as an end goal. The party then was officially de-Browderized and reconstituted in the mid-1940s, as we are currently covering in the active anti-Browderism playlist, with critics alleging that the de-Browderizing didn't go nearly far enough and that the party that was reconstituted ended up having a lot of the same problems that it had before. The party then had its ups and downs in the second half of the 20th century, and today has a reputation for making lots of opportunist errors, tailing the Democratic Party, not maintaining proletarian class independence politically, and so on. However, making lots of opportunist errors, tailing the Democratic Party, not maintaining proletarian class independence politically, and so on. Has a reputation for making lots of opportunist errors, tailing the Democratic Party, not maintaining proletarian class independent errors, tailing the Democratic Party, not maintaining proletarian class independence politically, and so on. However, the overall political climate in the early 21st century, whether it was the extreme right turn of the Bush-Cheney administration, with its initiation of the Department of Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, and other police state measures under the guise of fighting the, quote, global war on terror, or the 2008 global financial crisis and the fallout from that, as the capitalists have tried to push all of the costs of that crisis onto the working class by cutting programs under the slogans of austerity, shared sacrifice, etc., has caused a lot of younger adults in particular to look ahead to what kind of future they might expect from this changing climate, not just economically and politically as capitalism goes into crisis globally, but also the actual climate and the very real prospects of an apocalyptic ecological collapse within our lifetimes, and accordingly have been trying to figure out what do we do politically? How do we orient ourselves to take power away from the system which is running the collective future of humanity and other species into the ground? And at the same time, vastly improved instantaneous global communication technology is enabling discussions and information sharing on an unprecedented scale, and it is allowing people to power away from the system which is running the collective future of humanity and other species into the ground. And at the same time, vastly improved instantaneous global communication technology is enabling discussions and information sharing on an unprecedented scale, and it is allowing people to reevaluate some of the political options such as Marxism-Leninism, which we were told several decades ago with the destruction of the USSR was off the table. We had reached the end of history, etc. We're just in capitalism's hands now. And a lot of people are saying no. You know, they're gaining class consciousness and trying to organize, and then there is this clash with the old, stodgy CPUSA, which is not really equipped in its present condition to be the vehicle that the working class needs to end capitalism. So there's a conflict there, and that has taken a number of different forms, and like I said, we've tried to spotlight that here at Socialism for All. Now, our orientation on this channel is more generally anti-revisionist. Anti-revisionism is a broad topic, but generally when we talk about some of the major projects of 20th century socialism, like the USSR and the People's Republic of China, we would say that in the case of the USSR, it's fairly non-controversial that the USSR at least had a revisionist phase when in the 50s and 60s under Khrushchev, when more of a petty bourgeois and/or new bourgeois line took hold in the party as against the proletarian line. Now, even among those who recognize that phase of modern revisionism, there is disagreement as to whether these errors were corrected, and the CPSU got back on track in the subsequent Brezhnev years, but, you know, that's a topic for another video. Then, as regards China, there is a big question of whether parties uphold the quote-unquote market reforms of the late 70s under Deng Xiaoping. These were major changes in the Chinese economy which allowed vastly expanded capitalism in pursuit of opportunities for increased participation in imperialist bodies like the IMF. So you have those who do not recognize China as revisionist, but consider this massive expansion of capitalism as a valid step in the development of socialism. And then even among those who do not accept, quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics as actually socialist, there's disagreement on where in the timeline China actually got off course, whether this goes back through Mao Zedong's tenure or whether the problems actually started after Mao. Anyway, I mentioned this brief overview because it's important to note that CPUSA, like some of the other larger groups such as PSL, also the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, do uphold China as socialist today. So for people jumping ship from CPUSA, those are other possibilities. The PSL having a lot of members who consider themselves Marxist-Leninist, although the party itself is actually Marxist, which is an old offshoot of Trotskyism. And anyway, some of these parties have made calls for disaffected CPUSA members to come join them. Also this year, 2024, has seen the creation of 2 new parties, or at least one real party and one kind of imaginary scam party, the real party being the Trotskyite RCA, or Revolutionary Communists of America, that party and them. Also this year, 2024, has seen the creation of 2 new parties, or at least one real party and one kind of imaginary scam party, the real party being the Trotskyite RCA, or Revolutionary Communists of America, that being a project of the IMT, or International Marxist Tendency, which I can't recommend and do not allow to be promoted in the comments on this channel on the basis that they are Trotskyite. Then the other fake internet grifter scam party is the ACP, or American quote-unquote fake, promoted in the comments on the which I can't recommend and do not allow to be promoted in the comments on this channel on the basis that they are Trotskyite. Then the other fake internet grifter scam party is the ACP, or American other fake internet grifter scam party on the basis that they are Trotskyite. Then the other fake internet grifter scam party is the ACP, or American quote-unquote communist quote-unquote party. This one was co-founded by Jackson Hinkle, Infracell, Midwestern Mussolini, and other based by Jackson Hinkle, Infracell, Midwestern Mussolini, and other founded by Jackson Hinkle, Infracell, Midwestern Mussolini, and other basically right-wing Nazbol types. And there's been an effort for some time to create a party in that vein, wing Nazbol types. Infracell, Midwestern Mussolini, and other basically right-wing Nazbol types. And there's been an effort for some time to create a party in that vein, incorporating strains of Duginism, Lyndon LaRouche cult-like Jackson Hinkle, Infracell, Midwestern Mussolini, and other basically right-wing Nazbol types. And there's been an effort for some time to create a party in that vein, incorporating strains of Duginism, Lyndon. This one was co-founded by Jackson Hinkle, Infracell, Midwestern Mussolini, and other basically right-wing Nazbol types. And there's been an effort for some time to create a party in that vein, incorporating strains of Duginism, Lyndon. This one was co-founded by Jackson Hinkle, Infracell, Midwestern Mussolini, and other basically right-wing Nazbol types. And there's been an effort for some time to create a party in that vein, incorporating strains of Duginism, Lyndon LaRouche cult-like stuff, a kind of neo-Browderism which got known under the name of Pat Socks or patriotic socialism, as well as a healthy dose of incoherent streamer ramblings incorporating misogyny and other manosphere-type stuff, anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment, and other kinds of bigotry. If you go back a few years, you had people like Caleb Muppet basically pushing that kind of line politically, although fortunately he was taken down a little over a year ago, I think, when it came out that the organization that he was the head of, the CPI USA, Center for Political Innovation, was involved in the sexual exploitation of some of its members and that he personally was involved in this. And we haven't heard too much from him since. There was also the PCUSA, Party of Nazbols USA, Pseudo-Communists USA, formerly the Party of Communists USA, itself a splinter group off of the CPUSA in 2016. Basically, they made appeals to people who were tired of the CPUSA's opportunism and revisionism and said, we're going to do it right this time. But then, well, they did do it right, but right as in right wing. You'd see the same kind of trends of Duginism showing up, and the party was basically just an internet club, which was run by one guy, Angelo D'Angelo, who one time nuked the Discord server because people were discussing one of their congressional candidates in too critical a light. So then this group spawned two splinter groups, the ACB, American Council of Bolsheviks, who did some good work, but then the PCUSA sued them in federal court for like $500,000. And then there was another splinter group, the CWP USA, Communist Workers Platform USA, and they're actually publishing stuff still at newworker.us. Anyway, the point here is that because CPUSA is the way it is, people keep trying to do other things in terms of forming a party. Some of that I think is genuine, and then other things like the ACP are just obviously bullshit that's trying to capitalize and grift off of the failures of CPUSA. Really cynically trying to manipulate people off of that into something even worse, as again I think PCUSA did before, and now the ACP is doing on a larger scale with more publicity and funding. For my part, I'm much more interested in the currently smaller anti-revisionist groups, whether it's the CWP USA, which we just mentioned, or a group called Red Spectre, who we've read some articles from in the live streams, or the American Party of Labor, who we've also discussed and highlighted on the channel. There are also some other groups and media outlets who are doing solid theoretical education, which I think that straying not too far from that is probably the most important thing at this point. In other words, not encouraging people to just wing it or go off of what your favorite streamer says, who's really just out for clicks and ad revenue, but to build that theoretical foundation so that people can actually get that correct and then move on to do correct analysis. And you know, there's Politsturm, for example, who I have promoted in the past, although I stopped doing that after they came out with what I thought was a terrible position on Israel's genocide in Gaza. Also, at the time when I was promoting that, I was under the impression that they were more of a party. I think actually they're just more of a glorified YouTube channel with some study groups. That's not to say the YouTube channel is terrible, but again, Marxist-Leninist parties are supposed to have some amount of internal democracy running off of democratic centralism. So anyway, I think that there is hope for rebuilding some kind of a theoretically sound party, particularly as we hold to the foundations of a typical Marxist-Leninist education, and then supplement that with notes on the various anti-revisionist struggles that have occurred in the 20th century and are still occurring today. But in the meantime, we don't really have that one clearly identifiable party that is doing it correctly, that has the close ties to the labor movement. I mean, that's another topic in itself. The labor movement is weak. Not only is there not communist dominance of the ideological leadership of the labor movement, which is definitely a must to engage in ideological struggle and to build that, but the labor movement itself is just at basically a century-long low in terms of its numerical membership. So the labor movement needs to be rebuilt. That means forming unions that actually use people power, intelligently planned and militantly executed industrial actions to get what workers want done. That is really the primary place that class consciousness is developed out of, that struggle, and then the political arm is a reflection of that. So after decades of concessionist, sellout labor union leadership, a lot of workers don't trust these organizations anymore, but rather than the response to that being an upsurge in militancy, it's just been kind of a decline in membership. That is starting to turn around now, but for a long time that was the overall pattern from about the 60s up until very recently. And then politically, these labor unions are still attached at the hip with the Democratic Party. They won't even stop endorsing them and endorse the Green Party, which would be probably an immediate step up. But, I mean, this is the low level of the struggle that we are in right now. And the CPUSA, again, not helping much would be probably overly kind. And with that, let's now turn to the story of Comrade Khadija, who had been very dedicated to the CPUSA in New York and recently announced her reasons for leaving. On why I'm leaving the party. It is with a heavy heart that I have to announce that I'm left with no other choice than to leave the party. I don't want to leave. However, ideologically I feel completely disconnected, not to mention altogether demoralized and hurt. In this letter, comrades, I'm going to say some strong things. As a member of the New York District Committee, the Brooklyn Club Executive Committee, former New York State Executive Committee, and former New York YCL or Young Communist League co-chair, I ask that you give some, at least minuscule space for my critiques that are in truth deeply caring. Even though they may sound strong, they're not bad faith. I've been in the trenches in this party. Please do not insult me and accuse me of being bad faith. Also, please note and understand my analysis is on tendencies and not people themselves. As someone who has given their labor to the party, emotional and physical, for 3.5 years, all while my daughter and I suffer the vice grips of housing precarity, I've given every morsel of myself, and now I must walk away from what I feel, I'm so sorry comrades, is an organization, it pains me to say, is blatantly, glaringly, uncommitted to, at the bare minimum, engaging in new and reinvigorating theoretical and practical organizing efforts, and seems to have a vested objective in keeping the party ossified and painfully static. Briefly delving into an historical interrogation of the party, rightist tendencies have been an unbroken thrum in the party since, most say, the Browderite dissolution of the party. However, from my analysis, this thrum, though embryonic at the time, began to extend at least 5 years prior to Browder's open turn to the right. We must acknowledge also what the brutal McCarthyist attacks have done to the party and the lasting impress it has had on its trajectory. Nevertheless, the party's rightist shift happened before the McCarthyist hunt. In essence, we're still, in this present juncture, confined, no, mummified in the Communist Political Association. And commenting for those who are not familiar with the CPA, that was when Browder led the liquidation of the Communist Party USA, the organization which briefly took its place. Continuing, further, it is these rightist through lines that Haywood himself spoke to and was subsequently ostracized for speaking against until he was formally pushed out. I have myself witnessed these rightist through lines, as many in the New York district have in fact. In the 3.5 years that I've been a committed cadre member, I've always felt somewhat ideologically disparate from the party. However, I continued to try to organize with the party, hoping that if I remained a committed, good-faith comrade and rooted myself in the theoretical study and practical work, the party would see the work other comrades and myself were doing, and they would begin to hear us out a little more, and we could, therefore, at least begin to engage in genuine line struggle. I was wrong, and this was an idealist mistake. The chairs of the Brooklyn Club really tried to encourage our efforts and uplift our work in and outside of every monthly meeting. I have to say, had it not been for my club chairs and comrades in the Brooklyn Club, I would have left sooner, and maybe my decision to leave may disappoint them, and maybe some others. I'm very sorry, but I truly can't continue to stay and give my labor to an organization that actively seems to be shunning militant black communists who refuse to engage in pacifist ideations. I was hoping that at our 32nd convention things would begin to shift. incrementally toward a more militant line with more input from the delegates there who opposed, quote, being mere appendages to the Democratic Party, quoting Marx and Engels' 1850 address of the Central Committee to the Communist League. Again, I was wrong. However, even before the convention, I began to feel fractured from the party. Last August, I wrote a commemorative piece on Dr. Mutulu Shakur, uplifting him as a militant and powerful revolutionary who contributed to the movement on many levels, including with his world-renowned acupuncture. I was told by Eric B. that this piece was not appropriate for People's World because it celebrated Mutulu's violent past, and that this was not appropriate for the mass readership of People's World or helping to organize them. I later reached out to Eric and told him that my piece on Dr. Mutulu never even mentioned violence. It only uplifts his acupuncture work, because I knew if I mentioned anything about his committed militancy, it would be an issue. He then admitted that he never read my article, but that it can't be published in People's World. Similarly, I wrote an article for the pre-convention discussion entitled Western Marxism, The Crisis of Words Over Deeds. I was also told that this would not be published on similar murky justifications. My other pre-convention contribution on imperial feminism was, albeit reluctantly, published after I told Eric I was not going to change or water down my thesis. The issue with the Mutulu piece happened a year ago, but I still stayed. I didn't want to just leave. I wanted to stay and struggle for the correct line alongside my comrades. And there were some strides made in terms of hosting some events and talks with people, but nothing structurally significant. The convention left me confused and disappointed. All of the people who've been in leadership on the National Committee for the last 20 or so years, or more, were again nominated and voted in, with the exception of a few new additions, all of whom are in alignment with Resolution 5. So commenting, Resolution 5 is titled the 2024 elections, and it begins by saying, quote, whereas the 2024 elections at the federal, state, and local levels represent a pivotal juncture, one might say the most important election of our lifetimes, a moment of crisis. The crisis we face features the threat of fascism, bellicose militarism, I think you get that from both parties, brutal racism, military assaults on immigrant workers, anti-human attacks on women, people of color, and LGBTQ people, and an unrelenting war on workers, and especially their unions. The crisis also includes existential attacks on our environment and smashing democratic structures, including the right to vote. It later ends by saying, quote, therefore be it further resolved that communists will give full united support and participation in the broad front to defeat Trump, Trumpism, and the MAGA Republicans. Unquote. You can read the rest at the cpusa.org website. And I'd just like to point out this is an extension of their hashtag Vote Against Fascism campaign that they've been running for election after election. They say that this is not an endorsement of the Democratic Party. Functionally, it is if you actually drill down and ask them. And the part that I think bothers me the most is this language about the broad popular effort to defeat Trump. I mean, it's the Democratic Party. The proletariat is not in the lead. That is a 1% owned imperialist party, which works hand in glove, good cop, bad cop, with the Republican Party to uphold and expand all the typical U.S. imperialist interests that one would think of. Anyway, that's what that resolution was. Continuing. Facsimiles of the same sterile ideas. Not one voice of opposition was nominated. Many comrades raised their concerns and nominated other comrades in the opposition to be in the National Committee. I also nominated myself from the floor. Of course, I was told that I didn't get enough votes. Voices of opposition and those in favor should have been counted aloud. They weren't. A comrade stood up and called for a secret ballot. He was told he was out of order. The resolution was deferred to the incoming National Committee, who of course passed it, but to provide a patina of democracy, asked people to submit, quote, language suggestions. Yes, CPUSA, where the democracy extends to how you wish to phrase the horribly opportunist positions. Continuing, the party's pivot to fighting against fascism, though this is critical, has severely truncated its socialist imagination. This uncritical lack of examination of all the moving components of fascism and its chameleonic character, the way it morphs and transmogrifies itself in mode, but never in kind within the structures of capital, has not seriously been taken into account. Instead, we are forced to accept haggard and worn ideas about the right danger, which is very real. We can't deny this fact, but this undialectical approach disavows the strong liberal anchor that fastens the menacing drum of the far right. Our party's analysis, therefore, does not thoroughly account for dense and rooted liberal collaboration with fascism. And commenting, I completely agree. As we've discussed before, the Democratic Party is a fascist collaborating party, not an anti-fascist party. Continuing, to heave against any ultra-left confusion, I'm not saying that Trump and the Brigadier Lynch terrorists are not an imminent danger to liberal democracy, which we ourselves have to interrogate, and which also was birthed from the mutilated blood of African and indigenous people. I'm saying to place heavy emphasis on the chauvinist sadism of one party when both have a proven record of shared complicity, telling people to vote against MAGA right forces while not placing brute class struggle as the spearhead and revolution as the ultimate aim is duplicitous at best, willfully collaborationist at worst. Again, so I'm not branded an ultra, although I know I am by some in the party, I am, to be explicitly clear, not denouncing the electoral struggle. The Trumpian white terroristic march is not to be minimized, as there is a difference between a fascist movement and a fascist state. I'm merely stating that to marshal that over and against militant class struggle amputates any kind of socialist imagination in the collective consciousness and locks the masses of frustrated people into the imperial capitalist two-party dictatorship. Moreover, if all we're ever instructed to do is to vote against fascism using the broken vehicle of the Democratic Party, the possibility of a socialist world is violently hijacked from us, and instead of liberation being at the fore, it is peripheried and bartered in the name of what's, quote, practical. Furthermore, practicality is employed to cut down revolutionary understanding and movement. So, yeah, I agree. In commenting, this goes back even to the Popular Front days during World War II, when arguably a lot of emphasis was taken off of revolution in Western Europe in favor of class collaboration, which did serve its stated purpose of helping to defeat the Axis and to preserve the USSR. However, this was taken to a lot of extremes, as we can see in Browderism. And it's strange to me that the CPUSA is still acting as though there's some kind of Popular Front scenario when the Democratic Party doesn't want anything to do with the left except to use us as their scapegoat. Anyway, continuing. As a militant black woman communist, I feel completely alienated from my party. However, it seems to be a clear pattern in the party to shun black communists who hedge against Kautskyite pacifist utopias. Again, let me be clear. Peace is our ultimate aim, and we should pursue it wherever possible. But in order to attain that peace, a just peace, not seeped in delusions about the outright brutality of the capitalist class, we must engage in class struggle with brute force. The most idealist and dangerous thing we can do is to think the ruling class and its repressive state apparatuses are going to let us just have a peaceful road to socialism when history has shown that they will wholesale annihilate anything that even attempts to threaten their global nexus of blood and profit. Allende learned the hard way. This is what happens when you trade placing the concerns of the most oppressed and allowing black and brown people who bear the brunt of capitalist degradation to be at the helm of the movement for a gutted and nebulous anti-racism campaign that doesn't offer a root-to-stem analysis of the capitalist problem. There will be many more black people who will pass through this organization and feel this daggering sense of alienation. Many more will be left feeling hollow and demoralized. A troubling pattern I experienced was the way black comrades with more palatable, integrationist views, integrationist not in the sense of an international cohesion around our shared aims of liberation, but integrationist in the sense of bartering liberation from capitalist asphyxiation, or a rainbow coalition fantasy land that pushes revolutionary class struggle to blurred and forgotten margins, were instrumentalized over and against more militant comrades who do not hold pacifist integrationist views. Militant comrades were scolded and infantilized for our views and told, quote, black people fought for the right to vote in order to kill discussion around the party mostly centering the electoral struggle. Black people, may I add, fought for the right to be free, not to be the gutted appendages for a cadaverous Democratic Party. At our convention, well-meaning white comrades were called racist by a white lady for challenging the black comrade who believed it was important to adhere to and uplift the fight against fascism line and for black people in this country to continue to use the Democratic Party, no matter how severely compromised, as a vector for change because, quote, black people built this country and fought for the right to vote, unquote. The white comrades were chastised and called racist and were called upon to fight against their white supremacist behavior. It is deeply insidious and manipulative to weaponize a person's perceived blackness and the fact that black people were locked out of the right to vote in order to keep them psychically butchered and cleaving for life inside the Democratic Party, a party that has preyed on the socioeconomic strangulation of the black community, the strangulation they themselves keep manufacturing so that they can play good cop, bad cop with the lynch terrorists in the Republican Party and obscure their role for decades. What twisted manipulation it is to call white comrades racists for rightly countering the rhetoric of the black comrade who employed the heavy adversity black people face in this country sociopolitically in order to keep them from wielding their growing class awareness to struggle against the Democratic Party and the two-party despotism as a whole, which seeks to maim their developing class consciousness and keep them enslaved to the Democratic Party, which is parasitically sustaining itself off of the blood and labor of black folk. These events, as well as the more general streams of Zionism that ebbed through the party, made me really uncomfortable, and I did not know how to navigate these things with some of the black and BIPOC comrades in the party who I felt sometimes took on the role of overseer to the more militant, non-pacifist comrades. Furthermore, you can't uphold the legacy of Claudia Jones solely in words when you have a militant black Trinidadian woman comrade who is left alienated and confused in the party. You must engage in revolutionary deeds, not barren words. On another point, I'm not exactly sure what happened with the Austin Club, but from reading their statement and assessing conditions in the party, the dissolving of their club, in my opinion, was unfounded. It was purported that comrades in the Austin Club were inspired by and trying to incorporate in their practical work some revolutionary black nationalist elements of organizing. Some members, from my interactions with them, have expressed disrespect and demeaning attitudes toward the Black Panther Party that they try to drape in the worn garb of, quote, critique. Interestingly, though, the same people who say that they're merely critiquing the Black Panther Party don't seem to give the same grace and energy for critiques of our party. This is an outright misrepresentation and vulgarization of critique. Reactionary wrong ideas have not only been allowed to develop in the party, they've been cultivated, and in some cases encouraged to a certain extent. Making fun of the Austin Club because they draw on the revolutionary black nationalism, in stark contrast to bourgeois nationalism, of the Black Panther Party is evidence of the deep through lines of anti-blackness that courses through the party like a virulent disease that's been allowed to metastasize. While there are segments of the Western left that do overly rhapsodize only the armed tactics of the Black Panther Party, and we should acutely examine this, there is a pattern by some within the party, and the broader Western left in general, to cloak their disdain for militant black communists in, quote, critique. Black leftists who denounce the armed struggle often use black militant as a paternalizing slur, and palatable leftists are used to scoldingly cut down non-pacifist black Marxists. The revolutionary nationalism of Harry Haywood, Thomas Sankara, Chris Hani, Steve Biko, Selma Francois, Maurice Bishop, Kwame Nkrumah, Lee Nelson Perry, Robert F. Williams, Lamine Senghor, Queen Mother Moore, Cyril Briggs, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Walter Rodney, Yusuf Salman Yusuf, Ahmed Ismail Hassan Yassin, Mehdi Ben Barka, Sekou Touré, Kwame Touré, Elaine Brown, Huey, etc., all served to strengthen and deepen the analysis of the world socialist movement. If comrades were given the proper theoretical guidance by the party, they'd know these very basic and obvious things are a part of the dialectical course of history. If the very framework from which we work is disjointed and muddled, everything which is built upon that will henceforth reflect that disjointedness. There doesn't seem to be any real cohesion in the party in terms of practical work. Most of us, speaking for the New York district, do work outside the party in other organizations, which is fine, but there doesn't seem to be a weft connecting that external work with the party. Everything feels so disparate. Criticism and self-criticism, which is the very life force of the communist movement, is not practiced in our party. True and rigorous critique is altogether discarded in the name of accoladism and self-aggrandizing empty statements that do nothing but atrophy the growing class awareness in comrades. Without the veins and arteries of criticism and self-criticism, we come to celebrate and uphold reformist ideas, demeaning and attacking anyone who dare challenge the liberal veil of delusion, to uphold destructive ideas using sporadic injections of Marxist phraseology is to knife away at the global communist movement. On the point of ultra-leftism, one cannot deny that this tendency of frenzied petty bourgeois vicissitudes between Bakuninist terrorism and anti-revolutionary mania is a danger to building the global communist movement. The party, contrastingly, does not have a serious ultra-left problem. It has a thoroughgoing right deviationist problem. Comment, amen. And this has been the case for a super long time. As we've been commenting in the anti-Browderism series, William Z. Foster, who led the official anti-Browderism charge, kept warning as they were reconstituting the party against the danger of sectarian ultra-leftism. But actually the real danger was continued right-wing deviations, in other words, not thoroughly uprooting Browderism. Because where does that come from in the first place? Well, revisionism, as we understand it, is when bourgeois ideas get interjected into the communist vanguard. When bourgeois ideology enters the workers' movement, it creates social democracy. When it enters the communist movement, it creates revisionism. So essentially it's a reflection of the class struggle in the realm of ideology. And in a country like the United States, which is one of the global headquarters of the advanced monopoly capitalist or imperialist system, it's only natural to expect that the intensity of bourgeois propaganda and the ferocity of the bourgeois ideology being pushed on working people is going to be some of the strongest anywhere. And that pressure is also placed on the communist movements within countries like that. So that, generally speaking, is going to be your main danger. It's not to say that people can't engage in ultra-left or pseudo-left kinds of errors, but that is not the major problem you have to be on the lookout for. Anyway, continuing, with all the scattered ideology monopoly capitalist or imperialist system, it's only natural to expect that the intensity of bourgeois propaganda and the ferocity of the bourgeois ideology being pushed on working people is going to be some of the strongest anywhere. And that pressure is also placed on the communist movements within countries like that. So that, generally speaking, is going to be your main danger. It's not to say that people can't engage in ultra-left or pseudo-left kinds of errors, but that is not the major problem you have to be on the lookout for. Anyway, continuing, with all the scattered ideologies in the party ranging from elements of Trotskyism to the dominant social democratic trend, one can see how rightist ideas were allowed to seat themselves in the party and ossify it. Also, the term ultra-left itself is not a slur. It is not something you uncritically hurl at someone as an insult. It is an unblunted analysis of a tendency within Marxism. Allow me to draw your attention to one of the footnotes in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. In the text, Lenin goes into an explication of the issue facing the Italian Communist Party with Bordiga and Turati. He goes on to affirm that Bordiga is correct in pointing out the destructive opportunism of Turati in his recognizing the dictatorship of the proletariat in words, but in deeds remaining seeped in parliamentarism. Lenin goes on to further castigate Turati, stating, quote, such a mistaken, inconsistent, or spineless attitude toward the opportunist parliamentarians gives rise to, quote, left-wing or pseudo-left-wing communism on the one hand, and to a certain extent justifies its existence on the other, unquote. Rightist tendencies, in essence, birth ultra-left confusions and impart legitimacy to them. In closing, when our party shuts down valid disagreement, when it seeks to quell voices of legitimate frustrations around the party line, it manufactures dissenting factions. It cannot stay mute while the party traffics in economies of right deviationism. Confliction points will rise the more one seeks to suppress disagreement. That is the natural dialectic of political life. Party leadership must take responsibility for all the recent factions and splintering they've helped to create. And commenting, that's one of the things that I was talking about in my introduction to the video. Continuing, factions are also a natural outgrowth of being in a party. It is not necessarily bad, depending on varying context, of course, for factions to form. Dissenting opinions inform and birth new synthesis. Party leadership also must grasp the stark difference between harmful factionalism and actual line struggle. The point of a party is to struggle for correct ideas that aid in hedging forth revolutionary movements, and when you cut off line struggle, you asphyxiate the lifeline of Marxism-Leninism. I can only hope that you can give a bit of space for my analysis and feelings. I can never hate the party. When my father died this past spring, the party was there, and they made sure that comrades who, like myself, couldn't afford to go to Chicago for the convention made it there. I've learned so much, and in my heart, I can never hold antipathy for the party, despite my well-intentioned critiques maybe being misinterpreted. There are also many good comrades in the party, but I have to be honest, I often wonder what this even means when comrades, though they have good intentions, do not do enough to stand against the rightist ossification of the party. I'm not saying these things as some sort of learned person. I hold no fancy degrees, no degrees period even. I'm saying this as someone, disenfranchised and gutted, who worked in a beauty supply in Brownsville, Brooklyn for 16 years. I'm saying this as someone who was a young mother in high school, as someone who is continually fighting housing dispossession, who came to the party for guidance, but many times felt shunned and lost. I will, with everything I have in me, continue to organize around tenants' rights, Black liberation, anti-imperialism, Palestine, Black womanhood, cultural work, unifying Korea, etc., as I did when I first joined the party 3.5 years ago. As a steeled Marxist-Leninist, I believe in the party as the primary vector to help guide revolutionary change, and I'm hoping to very soon find one committed to this most vital effort. In liberation, Khadija. And that is the end of the audiobook. So in closing, I would just add that this statement comes across to me as very thoughtful and caring, and it is similar to a lot of stories that I've heard over the 4.5 years of doing this channel. It seems like a not uncommon experience for people who study communism, consider themselves committed to communism, and really wanting to be a part and make contributions to the ongoing thread of struggle throughout history for liberation, to join this party, CPUSA, and to meet some good comrades, but to overall have the experience of saying, wait, this party is not doing communism. I know what communism is, I've read all about it, I've studied the foundations, and what they're doing is glaringly violating those foundations. So, like I said in the introduction, there are a lot of people, particularly younger adults, coming up in this post-2008, post-war on terror environment and finding it very bleak and gaining some class consciousness. And then with the internet, which is, again, a relatively new factor, engaging with all kinds of information and education, and they're going out into the real world and they're trying to do something concrete and productive, and they're finding that the CPUSA is actually more of an obstacle than a vehicle in a lot of crucial ways. So I don't know how that ends up. I don't know how exactly this gets resolved, but what I do know is this struggle isn't going away. It looks like the US right now, as we've been talking about for a while on the channel, is starting to actually enter that recession territory, which could be a big one. And people are not likely to become any more enamored with capitalism than they already were in the non-recovery recovery that happened after 2008. I think that what we're going to see, as happened after 2008, is the continued growth of class awareness, and the continued growth of a movement which considers itself anti-capitalist in some way, and the growth of the portion of that movement which is actually communist. And then we, the communists, must engage in ideological struggle within the left for correct ideas, because there are going to be all kinds of fakers, frauds, populists, grifters, charlatans, reformists, anarchists, you name it, that are going to pop up and say, we have the solution. Well, no, they don't. And again, I don't know exactly which organizations or parties or groups are going to be the thing in the end that becomes the vehicle. Whatever it is may not exist yet, may not have been named yet. But as people keep digging in and create this culture of actually getting educated in communist history and engaging with it critically from an anti-revisionist perspective and rejecting the duplicity and inconsistency of the pat and unsatisfying answers handed down by the ossified revisionist legacy parties. What we've seen so far in the early 21st century is an intensification of the contradictions of capitalism and an intensification of the capitalists' assault on workers' rights and living standards throughout the whole world. And we must agitate, educate, and organize for an intensified class struggle that can smash through these obstructive remnants and bring a victorious militancy to the emerging frontiers in the ongoing class struggle. That's it for me. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee support.
真意を知りたくば受けてみ
お静かに目を閉じて
真意を知りたくば受けてみよ
位置点絶縁障壁安全距離
こうだ
採血の
死の底へ
死れ終わりだ真意を知りたくば受けてみよ
お静かに目を閉じて夜ですねほら夜
死れ終わりだ真意を知りたくば受けてみよ
障壁吸引テスト開始
目を閉じて
採血の
ほら
時死れ終わりだ
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Under a False Flag by Lenin from 1915. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on description and social. Not only the best anti-fascism by our multi-part reading of Fascism and Social Revolution, 3rd edition by R.P. Dutt, 1935. Excellent book, not only the best anti-fascist book I've ever read, but also a great jumping off point for learning about Marxism-Leninism. Now that that's posted on the channel both in a chapter-by-chapter format and also in a two-part complete format, I would have loved to have posted it as just one big file, but there's a 12-hour limit, and it is over 13 hours. I'd like to do a couple of things as quick follow-ups. There's another short piece I want to read called Fascism and Empire by Dutt, which will be up in the next few days, and then also a surprise piece, which is highly relevant to current politics. But also relevant not just to fascism, but also to a number of other topics related to opportunism. We've been talking about the CPUSA, Browderism, electoralism, is this piece, Under a False Flag by Lenin. So it was around this time that Lenin was writing Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. We haven't done that book on the channel yet. We'll be doing it soon. But Lenin also did a number of shorter pieces like Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, in which he goes over some of the characteristics of the imperialist era. So what is the imperialist era? Well, in a nutshell, Lenin described it as advanced monopoly capitalism. And then it has some other particular characteristics. But if you really wanted to just get it down to the shortest possible description, advanced monopoly capitalism, as distinct from the earlier period of capitalism, when capitalism was overthrowing feudalism and was still historically progressive. Under imperialism, capitalism has reached a point of development where it becomes stagnant and moribund and is basically this huge conglomeration of military-industrial complexes and interlocking boards of directors. And while it is progressive compared to the earlier stage of pre-monopoly capitalism, in order for historical progress to continue, a proletarian revolution must occur. occur and the building of socialism must begin. So again, in other words, this is the late stage capitalism which has run out of developmental road. From this point until the proletarian revolution, it only can try to manage and govern the social decay that it oversees while trying to grub profits as much as possible. And this is where fascism per se starts to enter the picture. As we covered in Fascism and Social Revolution and other pieces, fascism is not merely violent capitalism. It is a consequence of an overdue proletarian revolution, and it only arises in this period, the imperialist period. So back to Under a False Flag, which was written not earlier than February 1915, one of the things that we want to highlight in this attack by Lenin on the social chauvinists, who are in other words socialist in name but basically still clinging to the bourgeoisie and national chauvinist in practice, is that Lenin was making the case that in the imperialist countries the bourgeoisie could no longer contribute to progressive movements. And we say capitalists in the imperialist countries as distinct from capitalists in the developing countries, where national liberation struggles, for example, were still underway, whereas in the imperialist countries the national liberation struggles were already complete, and the capitalists there were turning from their completed national projects to positioning themselves for the maximum share that they could get out of the emerging world imperialist system, which is where all capitalists end up once the bourgeois nation state is fully formed and capitalist production has reached a sufficiently advanced stage. But we'll discuss it more once we get into the text. First, let's read the front matter. This was first published in 1917 in the first collection of the Proliv publishers, Moscow. Signed N. Konstantinov, published according to the text in the collection. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 21. HTML transcription and markup by D. Walters and R. Simbala. And it's in the public domain in the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's begin. Issue number 1 of Nasha Dielo, Petrograd, January 1915, which was a monthly of the Menshevik liquidators and a mouthpiece of social chauvinists in Russia, published a highly characteristic programmatic article by Mr. A. Patrusov, entitled At the Juncture of Two Epochs. Like an earlier magazine article by the same author, the present article sets forth the ideas underlying an entire bourgeois trend of public thought in Russia, the liquidationist, regarding the important and burning problems of the time. Strictly speaking, we have before us not articles, but the manifesto of a definite trend. And anyone who reads them carefully and gives thought to their content will see that only fortuitous considerations, i.e. such that have nothing in common with purely literary interests, have prevented the author's ideas, and those of his friends, since the author does not stand alone, from being expressed in the more appropriate form of a declaration or credo. So just a quick note here on liquidationism. This was a trend within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party against which Lenin and the Bolsheviks fought. The liquidationists wanted to use only legal tactics of struggle and liquidate the illegal underground arm of the struggle. This was basically a manifestation of revisionist or crypto-bourgeois party against which Lenin and the Bolsheviks fought. The liquidationists wanted to use only legal tactics of struggle and liquidate the illegal underground arm of the struggle. This was basically a manifestation of revisionist or crypto-bourgeois trends within the vanguard, which previously had taken other forms, including so-called economism in the early 1900s, and as Lenin commented, it basically just kept reincarnating under different movement names. For a long time, the Bolshevik position was to fight liquidationism and to keep the party together. However, eventually, the Bolsheviks did split as conditions changed. Continuing, Patrusov's main idea is that present-day democracy stands at the juncture of two epochs, the fundamental difference between the old epoch and the new, consisting in a transition from national isolation to internationalism. By present-day democracy, Patrusov understands the kind that marked the close of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, as distinct from the old bourgeois democracy that marked the end of the 18th century and the first two-thirds of the 19th. At first glance, it may seem that the author's idea is absolutely correct, that we have before us an opponent to the national liberal tendency predominant in present-day democracy, and that the author is a, quote, internationalist, not a national liberal. Indeed, this defense of internationalism, this reference to national narrow-mindedness and national exclusiveness as features of an outworn and bygone epoch, is it not a breakaway from the wave of national liberalism, that bane of present-day democracy? or rather, of its official representatives. That, at first glance, is not only the possible but the almost inevitable impression, yet it would be a gross error to think so. The author is transporting his cargo under a false flag. Consciously or otherwise, that doesn't matter in this instance, he has resorted to a stratagem by hoisting the flag of internationalism so as the more securely to transport under this flag his contraband cargo of national liberalism. After all, Patrusov is a most undeniable national liberal. The gist of his article, and of his program, platform, and credo, is in the employment of this little, and if you wish, even innocent, stratagem in carrying opportunism under the flag of internationalism. So commenting here, of course, Lenin is trying to say that Patrusov is trying to smuggle in national liberal views while labeling them as internationalism, which they are not. Continuing, one must go into all the details of this maneuver, for the matter is of prime and tremendous importance. Patrusov's use of a false flag is the more dangerous, since he not only cloaks himself with the principle of internationalism, but he also assumes the title of an adherent of, quote, Marxist methodology. In other words, Patrusov pretends to be a true follower and exponent of Marxism, whereas in actual fact, he substitutes national liberalism for Marxism. Patrusov tries to, quote, amend Kautsky, accusing him of, quote, playing the advocate, i.e. of defending liberalism now of one shade, now of another, that is to say, the liberalism of shades peculiar to various nations. Patrusov is out to contrast national liberalism, for it is absolutely indubitable and indisputable that Kautsky has become a national liberal, with internationalism and Marxism. In reality, Patrusov is contrasting particolored national liberalism with national liberalism of a single color, whereas Marxism is hostile, and in the present historical situation, absolutely hostile to any kind of national liberalism. We shall now go on to show that such is the case and why. So that's the end of the introduction, and to comment, Kautsky here is Karl Kautsky, an opportunist German socialist leader who at one time was a dedicated and respected Marxist, and then in World War I used his leadership position to completely sell out the working classes of Europe. Lenin wrote a lot about Kautsky, including an entire book, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, which is recommendable, and we do have it on the channel. But as for Patrusov, what Lenin is saying is that Patrusov's polemic against Kautsky does not actually contrast national liberalism with internationalism, it contrasts different kinds of national liberalism. So let's continue. Section 1. The highlight of Patrusov's misadventures, which led to his setting out under a national liberal flag, can best be understood if the reader examines the following passage in his article. Quote, with their characteristic temperament, they, meaning Marx and his comrades, attacked the problem no matter how difficult it was. They diagnosed the conflict and attempted to determine the success of which side opened up broader vistas for possibilities desirable from their point of view. Thus they laid down a certain basis on which to build their tactics, unquote. The success of which side is more desirable. This is what has to be determined, and that from an international, not a national, point of view. This is the essence of the Marxist methodology. This is what Kautsky does not do, thus turning from a judge, or a Marxist, into an advocate, a national liberal. Such is Patrusov's line of argument. Patrusov himself is most deeply convinced that he is not playing the advocate when he defends the desirability of success for one side, namely his own, and that conversely, he is guided by truly international considerations with regard to the egregious sins of the other side. Patrusov, Maslov, Plekhanov, etc., who are all guided by truly international considerations, have reached the same conclusions as Patrusov has. This is a simple-mindedness that borders on, well, we shall not make undue haste, but shall first complete an analysis of the purely theoretical question. The success of which side is more desirable was established by Marx in the Italian War of 1859, for instance. Patrusov dwells on this particular instance, which he says, quote, has a special interest for us because of certain of its features, unquote. We too, for our part, are willing to take the instance chosen by Patrusov. In 1859, Napoleon III declared war on Austria, allegedly for the liberation of Italy, but in reality for his own dynastic aims. Quote, behind the back of Napoleon III, says Patrusov, could be discerned the figure of Gorchakov, who had just signed a secret agreement with the Emperor of the French, unquote. What we have here is a tangle of contradictions. On the one side, the most reactionary European monarchy, which has been oppressing Italy. On the other, the representatives of revolutionary Italy, including Garibaldi, fighting for her liberation side by side with the ultra-reactionary Napoleon III, etc. Quote, "Would it not have been simpler," Patrusov writes, "to step aside and say that the two are equally bad?" However, neither Engels, Marx, nor Lassalle were attracted by the, quote, simplicity of such a solution, but started to search the problem, or Patrusov means to say to study and explore the problem, of the particular outcome of the conflict which might provide the greatest opportunities for a cause dear to all three, unquote. Lassalle notwithstanding, Marx and Engels came to the conclusion that Prussia must intervene. Among their considerations, as Patrusov himself admits, was that, quote, of the possibility, as a result of a conflict with the enemy coalition, of a national movement in Germany which might develop over the heads of its numerous rulers. There was also the consideration as to which power in the concert of Europe was the main evil, the reactionary Danubian monarchy or other outstanding representatives of this concert. To us, it is not important who was right, Marx or Lassalle, Patrusov concludes. What is important is that all were agreed on the necessity of determining, from an international point of view, the success of which side was more desirable, unquote. This is the instance cited by Patrusov, and the way our author pursues the argument. If Marx was then able, quote, to appraise international conflicts, to use Patrusov's expression, notwithstanding the highly reactionary character of the governments of both belligerent sides, then Marxists, too, are at present obliged to make a similar appraisal, Patrusov concludes. This conclusion is either naive childishness or crass sophistry, since it boils down to the following. Since, in 1859, Marx was working on the problem, the desirability of success for which particular bourgeoisie, we, over half a century later, must solve the problem in exactly the same way. Patrusov has failed to notice that, to Marx in 1859, as well as in a number of later cases, the question of the success of which side is more desirable meant asking the success of which bourgeoisie is more desirable. Patrusov has failed to notice that Marx was working on the problem at a time when there existed indubitably progressive bourgeois movements, which moreover did not merely exist, but were in the forefront of the historical process in the leading states of Europe. Today, it would be ridiculous even to imagine a progressive bourgeoisie, a progressive bourgeois movement in, for instance, such key members of the, quote, concert of Europe as Britain and Germany. The old bourgeois pseudo-democracy of these two key states has turned reactionary. Patrusov has forgotten this and has substituted the standpoint of the old bourgeois so-called democracy for that of present-day non-bourgeois democracy. This shift to the standpoint of another class, and moreover of an old and outmoded class, is sheer opportunism. There cannot be the least doubt that a shift like this cannot be justified by an analysis of the objective content of the historical process in the old and the new epochs. It is the bourgeoisie, for instance in Germany, and in Britain too for that matter, that endeavors to effect the kind of substitution accomplished by Patrusov, viz., replacing of the imperialist epoch by that of bourgeois progressive, national, and democratic movements for liberation. Patrusov is uncritically following in the wake of the bourgeoisie. This is the more unpardonable since, in the instance he has selected, Patrusov has himself been obliged to recognize and specify the considerations guiding Marx, Engels, and Lassalle in those bygone days. There's a footnote from Lenin here. Incidentally, Patrusov refuses to make up his mind as to whether Marx or Lassalle was right in appraising the conditions of the War of 1859. We think that, Mering notwithstanding, Marx was right, whereas Lassalle was then an opportunist, just as he was during his flirtation with Bismarck. Lassalle was adapting himself to the victory of Prussia and Bismarck to the lack of sufficient strength in the democratic national movements of Italy and Germany. Thus, Lassalle deviated toward a national liberal labor policy, whereas Marx encouraged and developed an independent, consistently democratic policy hostile to national liberal cowardice. Prussia's intervention in 1859 against Napoleon would have stimulated the popular movement in Germany. Lassalle was casting glances not downwards but upwards, as he was fascinated by Bismarck. Bismarck's, quote, success was no justification of Lassalle's opportunism. Back to the main text. First of all, these were considerations on the national movement in Germany and Italy, on the latter's development over the heads of the, quote, representatives of medievalism. Secondly, these were considerations on the, quote, main evil of the reactionary monarchies, the Austrian, the Napoleonic, etc., in the concert of Europe. These considerations are perfectly clear and indisputable. Marxists have never denied the progressiveness of bourgeois national liberation movements against feudal and absolutist forces. Patrusov cannot but know that nothing like this does or can exist in the major, i.e. the leading rival states of today. In those days there existed, both in Italy and in Germany, popular national liberation movements with decades of struggle behind them. In those days, the Western bourgeoisie did not give financial support to certain other states. On the contrary, those states were really, quote, the main evil. Patrusov cannot but know, as he admits in the same article, that today none of the other states is or can be the, quote, main evil. The bourgeoisie, in Germany for instance, though not in that country alone, is, for selfish reasons, encouraging the ideology of national movements, attempting to translate that ideology into the epic of imperialism, i.e. an entirely different epic. As usual, the opportunists are plodding along in the rear of the bourgeoisie, abandoning the standpoint of present-day democracy, and shifting over to that of the old bourgeois democracy. That is the chief shortcoming in all of the articles, as well as in the entire position and the entire line of Patrusov and his liquidationist fellow thinkers. At the time of the old bourgeois democracy, Marx and Engels were working on the problem of the desirability of success for which particular bourgeoisie. They were concerned with a modestly liberal movement developing into a tempestuously democratic one. In the period of present-day, non-bourgeois democracy, Patrusov is preaching bourgeois national liberalism at a time when one cannot even imagine bourgeois progressive movements, whether modestly liberal or tempestuously democratic, in Britain, Germany, or France. Marx and Engels were ahead of their epoch, that of bourgeois national progressive movements. They wanted to give an impetus to such movements so that they might develop over the heads of the representatives of medievalism. Like all social chauvinists, Patrusov is moving backwards, away from his own period, that of present-day democracy, and skipping over to the outworn, dead, and therefore intrinsically false viewpoint of the old bourgeois democracy. That is why Patrusov's following appeal to democracy reveals his muddled thinking and is highly reactionary. Quote, "Do not retreat, but advance, not toward individualism, but towards internationalist consciousness in all its integrity and all its vigor. To advance means, in a certain sense, to go also back to Engels, Marx, and Lassalle, to their method of appraising international conflicts, and to their finding it possible to utilize interstate relations for democratic purposes," unquote. Patrusov drags present-day democracy backwards, not in a certain sense, but in all senses. He drags it back to the slogans and the ideology of the old bourgeois democracy, to the dependence of the masses upon the bourgeoisie. Marx's method consists, first of all, in taking due account of the objective content of a historical process at a given moment, in definite and concrete conditions. This, in order to realize, in the first place, the movement of which class is the mainspring of the progress